Hello YouTubers out there, this is Sheri Saravia the Movies. So today we're talking about Rob Zombie's remake of The Munsters, the 1960s TV show that certainly had its similarities with the Addams Family. And I have to tell you a funny story about this. Well, it's not a funny story, but it's interesting. Don't ever watch a movie when you are tired, because the movie may not work, and if you fall asleep, you'll think it's boring. So, what I saw of the Munsters initially, I just thought this is not quite working, and it wasn't particularly funny. So, but I fell asleep through a lot of it because I'd woken up early that day, and I saw it on Halloween, so I couldn't really. I felt I had to go back and watch it again. This actually, it's funny in terms of. This is the funny part of the story. In terms of films that I fell asleep and always had to go back and watch, were one in particular was Brazil by Terry Gilliam, back from 1985. That was one of those rare movies that I saw on video, and each time I fell asleep at the exact same point. Then eventually, I was able to see the film completely, which I love. I love Brazil. So anyway, getting back to the Munsters. So I gave it another go, and I watched The Munsters again, which is currently on Netflix. And I have to say, I was rather enjoying it. So for the first hour, the film works pretty well, I thought. This is naturally a prequel to the TV series, which I used to watch as a kid. And as you all know, it was Fred Gwynne as Herman Munster. In this film, it's Jeff Daniel Phillips, which is really not an easy name to remember, because at least the first two names are usually the first name that somebody has. Their first name is either Jeff or Daniel. Sometimes, of course, there are people also named Philip, but it's Phillips. And he is not quite as good at playing Herman Munster as Fred Gwynne was. Sheri Moon Zombie, Rob Zombie's wife, plays Lily Munster. And I have to say, it was a delightful performance. And the first hour of this film is breezy, it's really quite upbeat, and probably should have been an hour and a half long. But after the first hour, I thought the film got a little bit repetitious. Now, that's not to say that it was boring, but it just kind of lost the flavor of what they established in the beginning, which is really this blooming romance between Lily and Herman Munster. And I thought that they played that very well. And both actors are up to the task of doing that. They're not nearly as good as the original actors, especially Yvonne DiCarlo as Lily Munster from the TV series. And Sheri Moon has this thing where she has to, sort of walk and do this. And it's fine for the first couple of times, but every time it's just, just doing this all the time. But it was still a delightful performance. So I really liked the romance, and that's what actually I became more invested in the movie because of it than I was originally. And then there's the scientist who creates Herman Munster, basically just like Frankenstein's monster, has an assistant named Floop, not Igor, who is a bit of a dumbbell to say the least. And brains get switched, and of course the brain that was supposed to be of somebody intelligent and musically inclined or a poet or whatever is instead somebody that is a stand-up comedian, which Herman Munster is telling jokes that kind of went out of style long before George Burns and Jack Benny came into the scene. But what I was struck by this movie was one thing. One thing in particular was Sheri Moon Zombie. I gotta say, I've never seen Sheri Moon Zombie look more glamorous and just beautiful to see on screen. I've seen her in other films. Mostly she's done films for Rob Zombie. But here she was just, she was a complete delight. It was not something I expected. And, but what I like about the character of Lily is that she is very upbeat in her own way. She's very good-natured. She gives everyone a chance, including dating at the beginning of the film before she falls in love with Herman Munster, dating Count Orlok, obviously the character from Nosferatu, but looks a lot more like the one featured in, if some of you have seen Toby Hooper's TV version, great movie, Salem's Lot from back in the day. Looks a lot more like that than Max Schreck's interpretation of that character, his first. But anyway, she gives everyone a chance, and that's the thing about her character that kept me interested. Now, there's barely a plot in this movie. There are barely any farcical, comical situations. Not really. It's mostly about the romance, and that's where the film, I think, falters. If the film had been an hour and a half or an hour and 20 minutes, it would have worked better. Um, this is not necessarily a spoiler alert, but they go to Mockingbird Lane, but only until the very end of the movie. And then it ends with what usually opened the Munsters TV show back in the day, in black and white, which the film shifts to black and white. It's mostly in color. And it's gorgeous color, but the color schemes remind me a lot more, and I know somebody else said this, but it is true, of Joel Schumacher. If any of you have seen Batman Forever, with Val Kilmer's Batman, kind of looks like that. It's very garish color schemes, which sort of work in favor, but the whole film should have been in black and white. Anyway, it ends with the opening titles from the TV show, and they basically replicate exactly what they do with their entrances, or exits rather, from the house at Mockingbird Lane. Cassandra Peterson, who many of you know as Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, appears in this film, and she's dressed for Halloween as a green witch, so I thought that was kind of fun. Eddie Munster's not in this movie, and nor is and I can't remember her name, the normal girl, the blonde. They're not around just yet because this is a prequel. So overall, Daniel Roebuck is terrific as Grandpa Munster, even though of course he's not a grandpa yet in this movie. But he is terrific. He's really good. He evokes pretty much what Al Lewis had done in the show. So he came closest, and so did Sheri Moonzombie. I think she, not quite as sophisticated perhaps in her approach, or more adult as, say, Yvonne DiCarlo. Jeff Daniel Phillips, again, I think he gave it his best shot. He's too soft voice. There was something about Fred Gwynne, who has a deep bass of a voice, and also sort of an authoritarian presence. That's really Fred Gwynne, which worked because it's Frankenstein's monster essentially. That's what, it's got the bolts and in the neck and everything, and but the guy, let's be clear, Herman Munster was never very bright, especially Fred Gwynne's portrayal in the TV show. But there was something more imposing, I guess you could say, about that Herman Munster back in the day, whereas Jeff Daniel Phillips may as well be doing an interpretation on a Nickelodeon show. The movie feels like a Nickelodeon movie, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it reminded me of a 90s type of Nickelodeon approach, rather than what Rob Zombie probably was intending to do, who's a huge fan of the Munsters, which was a black and white Universal Monsters type movie. Now that would have been great if it was shot in black and white, and also if there was more of a story other than this romance. The wisp of a plot concerns Herman Munster signing off the deed to the house that Lily Munster and Grandpa own, and I think it has to do with Lily's brother, who's a werewolf, played by Thomas Boykin. It's a very good performer. He's kind of like a con man, and I like that part of the movie as well. And Herman Munster signs it without really thinking about it, because he's not bright. So then that's where they call to find out about buying a house at Mockingbird Lane. And those sections of the movie, which take up about 20 to 30 minutes, are not very interesting. They're not very funny. It could have been so much more. And they could have had a real story. I think, I saw a episode of The Munsters not long ago. And I used to watch the show as a kid. I couldn't tell you the episodes because it's been over 50 years since, or less than 50 years ago since I've seen them. But a recent episode I watched had to do with Herman Munster buying a used car from a con man, to say the least, played by Frank Gorshin. The late Frank Gorshin, of course, played Riddler in the Batman TV show from the 60s. And the car, there are problems with the car, and it doesn't run. And there was so much more story invested in just that half hour of that show, in that episode especially, than there is in this movie. But I will say, because of the upbeat, blooming romance, really, between these two characters, it sold me. So I don't love the movie. I have a mixed reaction, but I do recommend watching it. Of course, there are many critics, especially on YouTube, who hate this movie. They despise it. They don't like it. It may be the only family-friendly movie Rob Zombie ever makes. But so it could have been a lot better. The jokes could have been sharper and better, more irreverent. More reverence really was needed, because the show itself was always a little irreverent, and Addams Family even more so. So it ain't quite like even the Addams Family movies, particularly Addams Family Values, or for that matter, the recent Addams Family animated film. This one is not quite as good as that, but it is a decent try. So check it out. If you're a Rob Zombie fan, you have to see it, of course. If you're not and you're a fan of the Munsters, you may still be sort of on the fence about it, but it ain't the worst thing in the world. So, I don't know. Check it out on Netflix. And that's all I got to say about that. And this is Sheri Saravia at the Movies, signing off.